Now that we can resolve a SQL repository with a nested dependency, let's see if we can resolve an invoice service. Really, the only big change here is that it requires two constructor parameters, but this shouldn't be a problem for our tests. So I will copy the existing test method that we have, paste it in here, and I want to see if this can resolve a concrete type. In other words, if I have told the container about what component I want to use for an iLogger and what component I want to use for a repository of employee, then what happens if I ask it for a service like the invoice service? I just want to assert that I get a service back and that service isn't null. Control RA to run the tests, and that test fails. And it fails because of the exception that we throw inside of the container about could not resolve and then some specific type. That basically means that invoice service was not registered in the container, so the container just gives up and throws an exception. But one feature that many containers have is that if you ask for a concrete type like invoice service, something that can be instantiated directly, the container will just go ahead and instantiate that without requiring any configuration. Because what we really want the container to do here is to figure out that invoice service requires these other dependencies, and it can take care of constructing that service and passing in the proper repository in the logger. And to get that to work just requires a little extra logic inside of here. So I could say if the map contains that source type, we'll try to create an instance. Otherwise, if our source type is not abstract, well, maybe we can just try to create that instance directly. So create an instance of source type. So an additional if statement, an additional 4 lines of code. I would like to have one return statement in this entire method. So it might be nice to refactor this and have some variable that I assign the return value of create instance to and just return it at the bottom. But that's some refactoring I can do once I make sure all the tests pass. And when I do hit Control RA, indeed, we now have 3 passing tests and we can resolve an invoice service. But here's the catch that someone's going to throw. Let me go back into that services class. And now someone comes along and says, oh, you know, actually, we don't send invoices to employees. We have a customer class and we send invoices to customers. And now if I run the test, we'll be back to a failing test because the container doesn't know about iRepository of customer. No one has told it how to use iRepository of customer. It only knows iRepository of employee. So the question is then, in these situations, do we have to configure the container to know about each individual repository? Do I have to go through and change this to customer? And if I have 5 different repositories, do I have to configure all 5 or all 10 or all 15 or all 30? And the answer is no. It would be nice to try to avoid that situation. It would be nice if I could tell the container that for iRepository of anything, use a SQL repository of that thing. But there's a couple problems with this. First of all, this is an unbound generic like we talked about in the beginning of this module, but this unbound generic syntax only really works with type of. So I wouldn't be able to use this as a generic type argument. I would have to say for type of unbound iRepository, please use type of unbound SQL repository. And now if I just get my parentheses to match up, we should have a statement that compiles because earlier we did provide an overload of 4 that takes a system.type reference, and the same thing for use. So the syntax looks a little bit funny, but this would be a big help for the container because now we wouldn't need to configure 15 different repositories. We're just basically saying anytime someone needs an iRepository of T, use a SQL repository for that T. But what we will need to do now is some additional work inside the container because I just ran the tests and it tells me it still cannot resolve iRepository of customer. It doesn't have that specific type registered. Essentially what we're asking for now is that we've configured iRepository, the unbound generic type, and mapped that to SQL repository. But when we actually need an invoice service, it's asking for a closed constructed type, iRepository of customer. So this is going to require some additional work with reflection inside of the container. What I could do is provide another branch of logic here, essentially saying, okay, we looked up at the source type in the map, we didn't find it. And I want to find out if the source type is a generic type. Because if it is, now I want to go into the map and see if it contains a key for the source type .get generic type definition. So let me reformat this code just a little bit so everything's on the screen and tell you that this get generic type definition, what it can do is basically tell you the generic type definition that was used in the construction of this generic type. So this source type, if it's a type like iRepository of customer, that's a generic type, and its generic type definition is really that iRepository of T. It's that unbound generic type that needs some arguments applied to actually be something that can be constructed. But what this line of code will do is, if someone passes in iRepository of customer, we will look in the map for iRepository of T, the unbound type. And if we find that, what we need to do is come up with a destination type that is based on that type definition. So I want to go into the map and again look for source type .get generic type definition and retrieve that reference. And just like we did before in the opening of this module, I need to turn that into a closed type by taking that destination type and using make generic type and passing in the type arguments that are needed to construct an instance of this object. And where do I get those type arguments? Well, the source type will have them. Because if source type is an iRepository of customer, then source type dot generic type arguments will return an array of type with one entry where that entry is type of customer. And if there's multiple generic type arguments, then it could get all of those and pass them in to make this closed destination type. And now that I've massaged the destination a bit, I should be able to say return create instance of this closed destination type. And let's try to run that. And now all my tests pass. And now you're probably thinking, wow, generics and reflection, they're really hard to reason about. They're hard to think about. And yes, that's true. The first time I ever wrote code like this, it took me quite a while to actually internalize and wrap my head around what was happening. But like everything else in computer science, once you write this code and have this experience, it's a little easier to understand what's happening the second time you do it. But hopefully you can also see that the combination of reflection and generics is quite powerful. Now I have the ability to write simple expressions that say things like, for any iRepository, create a SQL repository, and actually have that work when someone requests a specific type like an iRepository of customer. And this then is our simple container. It is roughly 87 lines of code and perhaps needs some refactoring to get rid of some of the complexity that's inside of Resolve. But we've been able to put it all together with generics and reflection. And we've built a nice API for people to use with this container, which is a useful academic exercise, but there are so many more things that I would need to add to a real container before it would be ready for production. It needs better parameter validation. It needs better error messages. It's not even managing the scope or the lifetime of loggers. It has no ability to create singletons. We could keep adding features to this container, but I'm going to stop now because I think I've reached the point where hopefully you can see the combination of generics and reflection can be quite useful.